Okay.
There we meet again. There we meet again. Welcome everyone to a session that will be facilitated on this other side of the platform. We hope you're still enjoying yourself. I see some questions have came through. Tumel has asked a question, and a number of you have asked questions, and this is certainly the platform that you'll also get a chance to ask those questions. Keep them coming. I hope our panel will have a chance to look at them a little later on. As I said, some of the big questions will be answered here, and one of which is all infrastructure big? And that's the next. The panel will tell us through which it is a big. Is all infrastructure big, or how do we should we understand our infrastructure, in particular in South Africa, local municipalities to be precise? To help me facilitate this session or to take over the session is David Savage, who's joining us from George, I understand. David is the head of the provincial department or provincial treasury in the Western Cape. A man with a very short bio, but I can tell you there's more to this. And I'd like to introduce David as an experienced lead with a demonstrated history of leading and working in international and domestic public sector programs. David has a strong professional skills in sustainable development, public policy and management, public finance policy and management, infrastructure finance, as well as development finance. Ladies and gentlemen, joining us now live from George is David. David, when you're ready, please take us through.
Great. Thank you. Thank you very much for the introduction. And yes, very good afternoon to everyone here. I'm in the Southern Cape. I'm near George. I'm in the town of Mossel Bay, in fact, which is a port city. It's one of our three port cities in the Western Cape. And a very interesting one because it's actually one of our better governed municipalities as well in the Western Cape. It's one of the top performers amongst our municipalities in South Africa. But we're here today, I think, with a very, very interesting panel to really discuss some issues that you've been dwelling on in the course of the morning around sustainable municipal infrastructure, expenditure and governance. And so I think what we want to do is get into some questions like, what do we mean by infrastructure? What constrains its delivery? How can communities help in infrastructure delivery, particularly through driving value for money? And where are we getting things wrong in infrastructure delivery? I'm being told I need to increase my volume, which I will try and do. We joined for this discussion by a panel, some of which you've met before. In the morning, you had a chance, I think, to meet with Andrew Donaldson. Andrew is a former Deputy Director General in the National Treasury, Public Finance and the Budget Office, and perhaps has made one of the seminal contributions to public finance and public economics in South Africa in the course of his career. He's also former head of GTAC. And I think someone who's always willing to help solve a wicked problem. We are also joined by Sean Phillips, who is the Director General of the Department of Water and Sanitation, but has a long history both in provincial and national government, dealing with infrastructure delivery challenges. He was responsible, I think, for setting up the Limpopo Roads Agency, as well as having a deep knowledge of infrastructure delivery at a subnational level in South Africa. Tarafara Setai, who you've just heard from in the previous session, is a Chief Director for Provincial and Local Government Infrastructure in the National Treasury, but also public sector innovator. Always looking for new approaches to solving difficult challenges. And then Thando Mhlanga from the International Budget Program is someone who's been working on what I regard as a really interesting and innovative initiative called Asivekalani, which emerged during COVID. Thando has been leading this project, which allows communities to measure the quality of services that are being delivered, particularly in informal settlements, and feed that information back to government to create constructive feedback loops that lead to improvements in the quality of infrastructure services that are delivered to most vulnerable communities in South Africa. And that's been showing some really interesting promise as well. So let me kick off by asking Sean a question on community water services, something that's now within your remit in your current assignment. Do you think that all infrastructure is inherently big when we're talking about infrastructure, or in some cases it's better to think about infrastructure in a much smaller sense, like a community water supply network or a small-scale footpath, as opposed to very large infrastructure assets? Over to you, Sean.
Thank you very much, David. Hi, everybody. No, I don't think all infrastructure is inherently large, and I think there's a lot of potential for small-scale infrastructure, community-based infrastructure. Interestingly enough, climate change and the increasing use of renewable energy is moving a lot of technological advances in the direction of smaller scale infrastructure provision. So now that you can get much cheaper solar panels and batteries, you can have small scale water supply and even small on-site sanitation systems that are coming. There's technology developing now, which means that we can, I think, increasingly internationally, in the context of climate change and water scarcity, there's going to be increasing movement towards more localized on-site forms of water and sanitation. We in South Africa, we are moving towards having a high level of community participation in catchment management through the creation of catchment management agencies. But I think that's somewhat different to communities actually providing their own water supply. And for that, I think the bigger the water supply scheme, the more complicated it is, the more management it requires, the more maintenance it requires. And if it starts getting quite big, you're asking a lot of community members to do that management if they're just doing it on a voluntary basis as part of a community-based management of a scheme. For large schemes which require intensive management on a daily basis, which require revenue collection and regular maintenance and skilled operation, it's going to be difficult for community-based management. There was a strong emphasis on community-based water provision post-1994 for a number of years, but that fell away to some extent in our policy environment after democratic local government came into being. And I think part of the reason for that was it was found that there was sometimes some competition between community-based organizations and democratic local government. But I think that there is potential, especially on the small scale, for doing a lot more with community-based service provision. And on the small scale, it's likely to be in smaller communities, particularly in rural areas. I think we threw out the baby with the bathwater to some extent when we just started focusing on local government alone and moved away from community-based provision after we got democratic local government. One thing I think we need to be cautious of is that just like local government itself, community-based provision can also be subject to capture. You can call it community capture as opposed to state capture. And that's ill-motivated elements in the community can take over community-based schemes, and they can also be subject to corruption. So it's not a silver bullet. So we have to be careful. We have to introduce it with our eyes open and be aware that there are those risks and try and manage those risks. And then on a final point is that I think we should also be careful about seeing community-based provision as an alternative to failing local government. Where there's failing local government, we need to fix local government and not say we can allow it to continue failing and we're going to expect communities to provide the services themselves while they have a failing local government which should be providing those services. Thank you, David.
Great, thanks very much, Sean. I mean, that's some quite provocative statements. And Thando, I wondered if you wanted to come in on these questions of community governance, because Sean is making, I think, a very important connection between the scale of the infrastructure asset and the complexity associated with the governance arrangements that need to follow from it. And so community scale infrastructure does open the door for community governance of that and management of that infrastructure. But that's not, as Sean quite correctly points out, a straight line. It's not an automatic flow. What are the things that can be done at the community level to improve the value of the infrastructure, the value that infrastructure provides to those communities that it's attempting to serve?
Thank you, David. I want to actually share something that I have put together that will better explain what I think about the value that communities play when it comes to the value of money and infrastructure in the country. As David mentioned, that I am in the International Budget Partnership South Africa, currently working on a project called Asivikelane, Let's Protect One Another. It's a campaign. I'm gonna try here to. Okay, so how we work as IBPSA and Asivikelane is we work with several NGOs, around 11 across the country, and we are working with over 4,000 residents from over 400 informal settlements. And what we do is we focus on basic services, and that is water, sanitation, and refuse collection. And on a monthly basis, we collate information that we ask residents, and we work with those residents to engage with municipalities so that they are immediate changes on the ground. So that's how Asivikelane works. That's how that is what I will base my answers on, and that's the evidence from communities. Okay, so informal settlements. I want to start here. Informal settlements. So in informal settlements, this is how an informal settlement looks. It is dense. It is really, really, it can be sometimes a dangerous area to live in. And in informal settlements, they use communal services. And this is important information. They could be using chemical toilets, ablution blocks, water tanks, for basic services, for sanitation and for water. And how communities play a role here is they are able to monitor these services. However, if there isn't, and if the environment doesn't allow them to monitor the services, it becomes problematic. So how communities can play a role in the value for money when it comes to infrastructure is, firstly, there needs to be an enabling environment for them to be able to monitor services, to monitor these outsourced services, because most of these services are outsourced, like chemical toilets and water tankers. And the first thing is, if procurement information is transparent and available, like tender specifications, like contract information, so that communities are able to say that, hey, this tender specification says that my toilet, my communal toilet, needs to be cleaned 3 times a week, and it has not been cleaned this week. So that's how communities can help. The other way the communities are wanting to assist, and they're struggling with this, is basically communities really want to be heard, and they want to have some sort of a relationship with municipal officials. And in Asuvigalane, what we do is, when we collate their information, what we do is we try our best to actually communicate with municipal officials, direct municipal officials, those who are seated at depots, those who are in regional offices that can actually make changes on the ground. And we've had instances where this happens. Where we speak to them about the evidence from these 4,000 residents, and we say that, look, this is broken and it's not working. How do we work together to make sure that it does work? So a perfect example of this is in eThekwini. In eThekwini, we have a relationship with maintenance and repairs, where we speak to them on a bi-monthly cycle about services that aren't working, services that are broken. Some of these pictures are from eThekwini. And because of the communication and the bi-monthly engagements that we've had, and this is not just us as the NGO, but us with the community representatives, we were able to have positive results on the ground. We've had new ablution blocks installed, new taps installed, and running taps that are leaking are no longer leaking. So we've had positive results from direct engagements with communities and municipal officials. So this is possible. Okay. And I do want to just share something really quickly about why engagement with community representatives or community leaders and municipal officials is very important. In Tshwane, we've been having monthly meetings with the rudimentary department. And in an informal settlement, Tshwane, the rudimentary department thought that, hey, we're paying the service providers every month and they are servicing, they are dislodging the chemical toilets. However, because of the relationship that we have with communities, and we were able to bring together evidence and pictures, we were able to prove that the service providers are being paid for services that they are not providing. And they were doing this for months, where they were being paid for dislodging chemical toilets, and that wasn't happening. They were being paid for cleaning those toilets, that wasn't happening. So as we all know, that municipalities are really, really strict when it comes to capacity. So having a relationship with communities is extremely important. They are your eyes and ears, basically. And if there isn't room for them to say that, hey, this is a problem, these issues are never solved. Service providers are basically being paid on a monthly basis or however, all the time, and they don't provide the services. The other way that communities can drive value for money in infrastructure is for them to be able to actually log calls, log fault calls. So we found we ask communities different questions like, has there been water in your area for the past 7 days? Was your toilet cleaned or dislodged? And has your refuse being collected this week? But a couple of months ago, we asked residents How long does it take for your municipality to fix a tap or a toilet? And 45% of our samples said never. And that is a huge problem. With our research, we've also seen that sometimes some of these faults are really small, they're really tiny. It could be a really small leak, but residents either can't log a call, the phone number might not be working, or you need to have an account number in order for you to have in order for you to log a fault. And informal settlement residents don't have account numbers. You need to have an address, and informal settlement residents don't have an address. Or sometimes municipal workers can't even find that tap. I jumped in earlier in the earlier session just for a few minutes, and I heard Mr. Pule saying that asset management is extremely important and a list of assets is important. But not only that, the location of those assets is really important, because we've had instances where we make calls for taps that are broken and workers can't find those taps. And it's a problem because it could take months for those faults to be fixed, which means the fault becomes a bigger problem, which means it becomes more expensive. It's now not just a leaking tap, it's like a sewage, and it's terrible, it's dangerous. So there are ways in which that this can be fixed, and it can be fixed by simply fixing the fault reporting system so that residents are able to log fault calls. And I will be quick. Okay, I will wrap up. Okay, I've mentioned what can be done here, and that is that there needs to be routine cleaning. There needs to be proactiveness when it comes to maintenance and repairs. And not wait for things to break, but some proactiveness when it comes to maintenance and repairs, a good balance of long-term contracting and in-house contracting, because some maintenance and repairs you need to have a 3-code system in order to fix a really small issue, when if only there was someone in-house in the municipality who could fix this. Adequate monitoring, communities can assist in that, and to also get informal settlements involved in repairing some of these. Some informal settlement communities are able to actually repair some of these issues. And of course, I've mentioned that a good functioning reporting system is extremely important. Being able to locate these facilities is important, and also expanding awareness and caring for public facilities, because these are communal facilities. And lastly, how communities can be involved is using the public participation channels that we currently have. They are not enough. They are sometimes quite limiting. Communities are only able to go to public meetings. Some of them, they don't understand the budgets, and this is where we come in and we assist them, and we workshop. We do some education workshop of what a budget is, what they need to look out for in a budget, what they need to focus on, how do they make submissions, and sometimes we have positive stories, like in the city of Johannesburg. Communities asked for an increase in sanitation, and that did happen. But unfortunately, in a lot of municipalities, this does not it does not happen, and communities aren't able to track if their submission did actually make a difference. And I think that is it from my side.
Great. Thank you very much, Thando. I mean, really interesting perspective that, community voice is not just in the needs assessment or the planning process, but it's also in the production of services and in the oversight of services right across the sort of value chain that there are positive contributions that can be made by communities. And if they're not heard, there can also be negative contributions, frustration that emerges. And we see some of the scenes that we've seen even recently in the media of frustration emerging in communities around the quality of services. But Pule, if I may go to you, Thando mentioned this question that it's often service providers who getting paid for services that they don't deliver, and that seems a pretty basic contract management issue that's part of delivery management and asset management environment. What is the Treasury doing to support municipalities and communities, in fact, to deliver local infrastructure in a more sustainable fashion?
Thank you, David. Yes, and it is a challenge to actually be in an environment where there is a contractor, but the contractor does not meet the minimum that they need to do. If you live in that community, then you know what I mean. There is a way that we need to be thinking about how the public, because this is public information, once a contract has been won, there has to be a way to actually make this contract visible to as receiving the service such as this. I'm sure talking to municipalities could be the best way to know what is the service level that needs to be achieved. But on a macro level, David, there is a reform. We call this the infrastructure delivery management system. So that we have 225 municipalities, local municipalities, 44 districts, and 8 metros. Okay, and all of them, they are of different capacities. All of them are in different geographies and servicing different types of citizens, clients, businesses, and all of that. It is therefore important to understand, even in a specific sector, right, that there should be guidance in terms of how infrastructure delivery can be done. Because, sometimes, for the longest time, my thinking was that there shouldn't be a problem with having an asset register, because I take that head of technical services is an engineer. He needs to find these assets. If not, he's going to have a service provider to do that, and because once you actually do that, then you can actually be able to prepare what you need to do for those particular assets to also be in a functional state. So what we are finding is public value. So there's value for money, which we understand, value for money. So you pay X for Y, and then you actually are enjoying that particular assets for what it is meant for, right? But public value is that particular asset needs to be acceptable in an environment that it is at, right? So public value talks to a couple of things. One of the things is, how do we then work with communities? And this is another extension of what we are talking about, to say, if you're a municipality and are spending money in spaces, the stakeholders that are there, how are you dealing with these particular stakeholders? Because it has to be an approach which is consistent, which is auditable, which you can actually be able to say, look, these are the people that we have been able to meet. But it does not have to be mechanical, because some of it really is not about a tick box. It is ensuring that infrastructure which has been installed in space can actually be able to be functional. And that involves a lot of things. It is not a straight line. So there is a level of what we call communications, developmental communications, which we should really need to be thinking about. But in the space that I exist or I work, there has been a lot of work that we have done previously, where we were actually really looking at how do we then involve different stakeholders in order to make sure that we can actually build knowledge around delivery of infrastructure, but not only delivery of infrastructure, including how the relations between all the stakeholders can be strengthened. One of the things that we are seeing now with this dysfunction on the 30%, and also the big questions around, some of the grants that we are seeing, is the value of these particular grants to the productiveness of, the reason that, the grants are being received. So there's an opportunity here that we need to be looking at to see how best we can actually use what we have. We have infrastructure which really needs to be looked after, but we also have reforms that are actually needs to be installed in institutions. So the easier way to understand this is, in an institution, you have to have a person responsible for something, and that particular person has to be held responsible for what he has signed up for. Now, if we have, vacancies, high rate of vacancies, if we have people that do not have the right type of skills for the work that they do, I've spoken about an element of what I call juniorization. This is, where people, a person is in a position, however, he is not able to do this work. However, he is actually given the position. And this is very, very bad, because for the work that is supposed to be done, and also if you really, follow why some of the infrastructure that we have is actually not performing that the way that it should, part of the problem is the capacity of the infrastructure unit. Well, not only infrastructure unit, but the whole body of people that really needs to be working in tandem to make sure that this happens. So the IDMS, therefore, is looking at all of these. It's looking at systems that are there to make sure that financially you can actually be able to look at resourcing of a particular, if is a warm body, or it is money that needs to go into a procurement process. That's why we're talking about infrastructure procurement. But we also are talking about how else are you able then to take this knowledge and you actually expand it beyond just the person responsible for infrastructure. What we are finding is that for us to actually be able to have a functional state, it really starts with a person with a conscience that this, what I'm doing now, it is for the good of many. And that's why there has to be a conversation that we need to go to around what really does it mean for a person to be a public sector official, and what type of qualifications does this person have for this particular role that the person has. So within the IDM, as the specific roles and responsibilities, we're looking at, partly organization structure, particularly in the infrastructure space, for the infrastructure colleagues, to say, are we structured in a way that we can actually be able to look after the assets that we have? So I can stop there, David. I'm sure there will be reaction to that. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Pule. I mean, I think you raised some potentially very controversial issues around accountability, consequence management, and the drivers of instability in the infrastructure environment. I mean, one thing that always strikes me about infrastructure is it's hard to deliver. And it takes time. And so any disruptions to those timeframes end up in delays, in cost overruns, and so forth. But so often in the local government environment, in this new world of coalitions, we're seeing a lot of governance disruption in our local government environments that is actually undermining delivery. So, Andrew, I think I want to hand the grenade, if it were to you, on this one. Given these failures that we're seeing at the local government level, why don't we just call it a day and centralize infrastructure services like water, like energy, like roads, or get a much deeper role for the private sector in infrastructure delivery? Why do we seem so wedded to municipal, local government level delivery in South Africa?
So, David, I think the answer is that there's not the slightest hope of the centre actually achieving the kinds of investment in human development, in meeting human development needs at the local level. There are 60 million South Africans. There are, whatever it is, 15, 16, 20 million households, several hundred communities, and the degree of information, the degree of knowledge, the capacity to manage the contracts that are required to deliver decent services to households across the entire country cannot possibly be located in one place in the center. Now, I do think there's a role for central programs that deal with dispersed areas in which capacity is very weak. So to go back to the community-based interventions that Sean talked a bit about, and that Thando talked about, if you have partnerships with organizations that are doing spring protection in a village of 20 households, and where you need somebody who knows what to do, and that knowledge is not locally available, and you don't need much investment. You need a bag of cement and some pipes and a tap, and you can turn a muddy hillside into clean water through locating the eye of the spring and protecting it. If that's what we mean by community projects, then clearly they've got to be organizations that are run that, and you've got to do, and you probably have several type of organizations that it was done in the 90s fairly successfully, and that needs to be centralized. But if you're talking about moving from township management that involves putting 50 standpipes on street corners and 200 mobile toilets along rows, and that's your strategy for water and sanitation for the next 10 or 20 years, and you're going to have monitoring of whether they get cleaned, and a whole creation of a whole of an extraordinarily expensive maintenance system to keep those services going. If you're talking about moving from that to investing in decent housing for the long term, then you have to be managing those programs through local government with proper accountability and management at the local level. And the funding from the center should flow where there is success in implementing things properly. I talked earlier about using matching grants. So this is an area where there is an unarguable economic case for replacing our existing conditional grant system with a system that rewards success, that says to municipalities, we will co-fund your investments in housing and municipal infrastructure, provided you do the jobs and do them well and get on with them. And the money flows when the projects get underway. It doesn't flow if they don't get underway. And that'll be a bit uneven in its consequences. It won't have quite the same equitable distribution that we would like, but it will get the job done. It's incentive compatible. It's the South African solution to the problems of incentives that Ivor Chipkin talked about in our earlier session. And I want to say something here about the balance between meeting needs in the short term and building for the future. Because if we are to succeed as an economy, succeed as a developmental state, if we are to do what has been talked about in a very important recent book on development economics as gambling on development, on growth, on progress, then we have to do what the world has known how to do for 150 years, and that is build decent housing through industrial processes, through property development and property developers' relationships with their clients being households, and municipalities taking a step back from that responsibility for the top structure and concentrating on building the bulk infrastructure that lasts for a long time. We will have to spend a lot more than we are currently spending. We should be doubling what municipalities spend on infrastructure in support of residential and small business development. We should be doubling it in a year or two, and that's not an enormous challenge given the excess capacity in our construction industry. And then it should grow steadily with a proper balance between maintenance and investment. But the point I made earlier in our earlier discussion, that you can only do this if you think patient capital, if you think long-term investment has to be taken hold of. We are at risk if we place too much emphasis on short-term responses to immediate needs, of simply reproducing an increasingly maintenance expensive system of residential infrastructure and services. And I think we have to be bolder than that. In small towns, it's going to need compromises with the competitive procurement environment that we inherit and that Pule is responsible for looking after. You don't have to have full-on competition. You have to have at least contestable markets in order to, and you will have ongoing relationships between local businesses and municipalities, and complicated conflict of interest issues that you've just got to find the space to deal with in the regulatory environment. My message to Pule, my message to the Department that's responsible for housing and cooperative government is get out of the way. The regulatory environment is far too demanding. MSCOA is far too complex for small towns and municipalities to manage, and we have to deal with much messier progress, but that is performance driven. That, to get back to my main point, is driven by financial flows that complement success, that reward success. And to make one other point that I might have made earlier, but have not, we are going to have to think through a transition from the distributional funding flows going to municipalities, municipal infrastructure grant program, the housing program, etc., the implicit subsidization of water and electricity through the equitable share and the municipal grants program. We're going to have to think through how we make the transition from that form of subsidization of services in low-income areas to subsidizing households. OECD countries across the world mainly subsidize households. They recognize who poor households are, and the subsidies flow to them. That's how you solve the problem eventually of municipal unpaid, uncollected bills, municipalities building up long unpaid obligations to Eskom and to water boards. Municipalities can then manage services on a cost recovery basis. Households are subsidized through the center. But of course, all of this depends on making progress with job creation and strengthening household incomes, which has to be part of a development strategy as well. So I'm wanting to cut across this challenge of municipal infrastructure and say, think about it in the context of being bold about the growth and investment in living standards in the economy as a whole.
Thanks. Thank you very much, Andrew. I mean, so that's really set the cat among the pigeons. Really saying, well, in fact, what we need to do is make price matter again when it comes to local services. And certainly one of the key steps we need to take in the South African context is to shift our subsidy system from the supply side, giving it to the provider, to the demand side, giving it to the household, which is quite a radical reform to our system and could make price matter again in how we deliver infrastructure and services. I want to throw that open to the panel more generally here and ask, do you think price needs to matter more? Do you think there needs to be more choice through the pricing mechanism than as opposed to voice through participatory planning and the like as the future for local infrastructure and services delivery at scale, which is the challenge that Andrew has thrown open to us. So that'd be one of the questions that I would ask for the panel. Does pricing matter? Does choice matter in infrastructure delivery? And let me then ask some other questions, because I think generally for the panel, and then I'll give you all a chance to respond. We've talked about governance as well. And clearly many of our municipalities are struggling with the complexities of governance in their environments. Is this a political problem? In the sort of political domain, or is it that our systems are too complicated, our governance systems themselves are too complicated, and our regulatory systems are too complicated, that's leading to these failures? And then finally, we have always talked about and have spent as a country billions on building capabilities, trying to build capabilities for local service delivery, but we seem to be moving in the opposite direction. So what explains that conundrum, as it were? So let me go to each of our panelists in turn on some of those issues, but also feel free to take up any issues that were raised in the inputs that you've heard, and then we'll get a chance after this to go to the floor. Those of you who are listening in and want to ask a question, you're welcome to put it in the chat bar or to raise your hand, and I'll come and ask you to respond. But let's start with you, Sean. Does price matter?
Yes, I think price matters, but also collection of revenue also matters. There's no use. Price doesn't have much meaning if revenue isn't collected. So particularly in the water and sanitation sector, the whole fiscal model for South Africa is that water and sanitation should be self-financing. It's the only sustainable way of running water and sanitation. Otherwise, if it's going to be subsidized, who's going to pay for it? It's going to have to be paid for by taxpayers from somewhere else, and that will be money taken from somewhere else. Now, our biggest problem is that we have such high levels of non-revenue water. It's somewhere between 45 and 50% on average across municipalities in the country now. And what does that mean? It means that while the services are continuing to be provided with that under collection of revenue, it means that we're basically subsidizing the water supply by cutting back on maintenance and operation. And we're basically getting our children and grandchildren to pay that subsidy, because our infrastructure is deteriorating due to weak operation and a lack of maintenance and a lack of rehabilitation because of the lack of revenue, the under collection of revenue. If we carry on like this, our children and grandchildren are going to suffer the consequences of further deteriorating infrastructure due to the lack of maintenance and rehabilitation. So we need to have, in an ideal world, water and sanitation services should be priced to cover their costs, and their costs should be efficient, and the revenue should be collected. And then we can have a sustainable water and sanitation system. And if those conditions are not met, we're going to have problems. Related to that is the issue of free basic water for the indigent, which could be made to work, but it's not working very well currently for various reasons. And that one includes that the indigent register system is usually not working well in municipalities. It's not managed well. It's clumsy, and it just seems to be something which was tried and hasn't really worked to provide free basic water through having indigent registers. The second way of possibly making it work would be to have make sure that we have metered household connections everywhere with block tariffs, and that the first amount of water can be free, and that can be subsidized by people who use more water. The problem with that is that our minimum norm and standard, particularly in rural areas, is still a communal standpipe rather than a metered household connection. That in itself is a problem, resulting in a lack of sustainability in the system, because communal standpipes don't result in any revenue, and there's no incentives for them to be used efficiently, and there's no controls to ensure that they only provide the free basic water. Going on to the question of our key problems at municipal level, in my assessment, our root problems are weak governance, which is related to the political level. And other problems that we experience can be traced back to weak governance. So, for example, people say that there's problems with infrastructure at municipal level because there's a shortage of engineers in municipalities. But you have to ask, why is there a shortage of engineers in municipalities? And if the Municipal Infrastructure Support Agency can go and hire engineers and place them in municipalities, why can't the municipalities hire those engineers themselves? And why don't they hire them themselves? The reason why they don't is because they don't want to. They've hired other people instead, and they don't have any money left, or they don't prioritize hiring engineers, or it's such an unpleasant environment to work there that engineers don't want to go and work there as full-time staff in the municipalities, because they can't really work properly as engineers because their technical advice isn't listened to. I don't think there are technical reasons for the poor service delivery at municipal level. The root cause is political governance issues. What you're looking at is the Department of Water and Sanitation in this regard is to learn from other countries, where in most countries, because water has to be run as a business in the sense that you have to collect revenues to cover your costs, otherwise it's not going to be sustainable. For that reason, in most countries, water and sanitation is treated as a utility function rather than as a municipal function with direct management by political leaders who haven't had any experience or knowledge of running water as a business. And we want to do research on possible fundamental restructuring of the water and sanitation services sector in South Africa to see if we can move it towards more of a professional utility type function, albeit still within the constitution. So there's still a reporting line to the elected local government. But we need to look at ways of implementing what the National Development Plan said of professionalizing government, and particularly for something which needs to be run as a sustainable business like municipal water and sanitation. It's very important to professionalize it and to make it run properly like a utility. Thank you.
Thanks, Sean. Let me go then to Thando. Do you think price matters? Do you think communities paying for services matters in terms of establishing those accountability relationships? Or is that a weak instrument for accountability?
Thanks, David. I think that voice matters more than price. The reason why I'm saying that is that communities can't pay for something that doesn't exist in their communities. There's communities that don't have water at all, or they don't have sanitation services, or it's just terrible, it's poor, it's not being monitored enough, it's not being taken care of, they don't feel heard by the municipality, or sometimes even the ward councillors, to say that, hey, the service provider didn't come today to dislodge my toilets or to clean it. I think that honestly, that the minimum standard of communicating and having public participation is really important. That should be like the first thing that government should focus on, because if government introduces, say for instance, it does away with free basic water and they introduce a price for water, and that is not that is just implemented, and communities are not engaged with that could be a really terrible idea and a terrible circumstance. But communities are sometimes able to come together and fix the tap, because they go almost a year without a tap at times, and they try to log a call and that doesn't happen. I know plenty of examples of informal settlements where they club together and they say, and they speak and they say, let's fix this tap and let's see what happens. So I'm not saying it's not possible. I'm just saying that voice is more important than price, because once you get voice, once communities feel heard, they could be open to price. They could be. But if they don't feel heard, it becomes a really dangerous and a sad situation where one has to understand that in communities there are several people that probably don't work, but in those same communities there are some community members that are well aware that, hey, this family, there's nobody working there, I'll help out. So they work like that together. That does happen, but they really do need to feel heard before anything like paying for basic services is an idea for them. They have to feel heard. Oh, and another thing, just one more thing. I'm so sorry. You spoke about governance and you said is the political problem, or would you say systematic? I see what Sean is saying, and I agree. But I honestly do think that we have really big systematic issues that can be fixed. Um, we've had an instance where there was a social audit that happened in Ekurhuleni, and out of that social audit where communities compared tender specifications, service levels to what they receive on the ground, they were able to convince the water and sanitation department to change the specs, so that the following cycle, there were completely new specs that were introduced by communities. And that small change had a systematic positive change. So it is possible to improve in the systems of how we do things, but honestly, engagement between municipalities and communities is really important in order for everyone to understand and see where the problem is, because there are systematic problems.
Thanks, Thando, and also thanks for getting the conversation going here. I mean, I think one of the things that really stands that for me is definitely on the radar, and that I'm sure over the course of this week you'll all be talking about, is the public procurement bill and where that stands, which is a key issue around infrastructure delivery management. And is in many instances going to encourage, if one were to take the Zondo Commission's recommendations, encourage quite a centralization of public procurement and infrastructure procurement. So Pule, I wonder if you have any thoughts on these issues. I would note also that Tumelo Motsepe did put a question for you around the role of SALGA as well in infrastructure delivery management that you may want to touch on.
Thank you, David. I think what we are saying is that South Africa is at the crossroads. And these crossroads are defined by what we really are talking about, because when we talk in the National Treasury and looking at how money is shared equitably to different spheres of government, or even having bodies like FFC checking on some of these things, so we have a system that actually is checking itself through these processes. So the one thing is that a combination of voice and price has to exist in this mix, because you're going to have to run a budget, and you have to run it within this time, and you have to work with the numbers, and it has to go through all of these systems that we have been built, however imperfect they are. I mean, the example that Sean makes in terms of the indigent, it really is something that a lot of people know that is a hack. So there are a lot of things that are known in the system. The question that I'm asking myself, and I'm curious to understand from a professional point of view, from a head of family point of view, from just a responsible community point of view, is when are we going to take these conversations and make it a thing that we live with? Meaning, if we see something wrong, how long are we going to keep quiet and say, well, it's them, it's not me? So I think the crossroads for me, colleagues, is realizing that the time has come for each one of people who live in this country to take responsibility for all of these things. Obviously, from a regulatory point of view, there's so much that you can do. You can't regulate behavior, right? You can influence it in one way or another. You can have, like we have now, in terms of the legal system and the safety sector that you can talk about. What I wanted to talk to as well, colleagues, is that the way that we are taking some of these conversations, it is true that it really has to transcend services across. But what I'm asking myself is, people live in a space, but we give services because people are there. It is not like there is a planning for human settlement, right? We always are, walking behind all the settlements has happened. So it becomes an in situ thing. It is actually, when you look at it, is that why is it that we can't think forward to say where are the next settlements are going to be, because it has to be closer to amenities. So all of the elements of where people needs to be, all of that is there. So the question I'm asking myself is, how are we thinking forward? Because we cannot always be reacting to things that has happened. It is true that what we have now, it is a political system that is also layered with administrative inefficiencies, complicated by all of these other things that we see every day. But there has to be a way that we really have to get in front of the curve. I would argue also that some of the things that we do, it is an overcompensation on lack of planning, or an overcompensation on things that we could have done better earlier, right? Now that we are here, there's something that we need to do about the now, but we really have to be planning for the future. We really have to be thinking about, what does it mean in terms of the next developments that are there that can actually be able to meet, a lot of, the things that we are talking about. The current reality cannot be divorced from the fact that there's something that we need to do now. So that means, if you look at the whole system, I'm asking myself to say, at this future time, or in fact, immediately, the fact that you could actually see some of the communities, solving these problems. Communities are solving these problems because they feel that there is an incentive for them. They will have water or something like that. So why can't we support things like this? And the big question around some of areas, I mean, in the rural communities, it is an understanding that the one with resources helps others, right? And in fact, there is a way of communal work, where people are exchanging, for one thing or another. So, for it to only be about money, there's something that we need to do really in actually fostering behavior, which really is something that it is beyond just the current how do you say brown systems that we have. Finally, for me, is that I feel all the time that sometimes there is now softer issues that we probably sometimes get into, which is not a hard budget or a hard process of building the bridge and all of that. But I think we have lost people in the process, right? we do not have confidence in the current leadership, and this is across the board. So we were in one of the meetings, colleagues, and a C-suite consultation. People that are wanting to invest money, but others are deep in research and all of that. The research that actually came out was it does not matter who sits in that seat as an executive mayor. I mean, it could be the Pope, it could be Mother Teresa, but the fact that you are sitting in that particular seat already is damaged by just you sitting in that particular seat. So there's something that we have lost in terms of the human nature. And I'm asking myself if all of our system are actually going to ignore the fact that everything is done through people. And as far as I know also that it is a hard thing, but it's something that can be controlled even, but it's something that you should not stop trying. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much, Pule. I hope none of your colleagues from the Treasury are listening in, because there were some quite radical statements that were made there around putting people at the center, which I guess as public servants is what we enjoined to do, both in the Constitution and elsewhere, is that we really need to have another hard look at what systems that we are building to pull people in the center of what we're doing in terms of infrastructure delivery. Even though it may feel like we're talking about concrete, we're actually talking about people's lives. That's quite a radical proposition for someone like Thando to hear from a Treasury bureaucrat, a Treasury C-suite bureaucrat. And I'll leave aside you bringing the Pope and Mother Teresa in there. Andrew, you've been present at the creation of a lot of the legislative framework that currently governs infrastructure delivery in terms of the PFMA, MFMA, the Treasury regs. Some of it almost seems designed to prevent community consultation, to prevent effective community consultation and prevent PPPs. And is the public procurement bill going to provide the much needed relief for these new ways of looking at the world that you were proposing in your earlier input? Or are we on a fool's errand, hoping for relief from via the public procurement bill?
I don't know what's in the procurement bill and what's still under discussion, and I don't know whether it's going to solve the problems. I do think that the system is quite complex as presently structured, and I think that we may be overplaying the importance of the procurement aspects of the fiscal reform that we need. There's no question that the procurement system is where a lot of the disease bubbles out, where a lot of the dysfunctionality becomes manifest. But I think that there are deeper problems in our fiscal architecture, and one of them has to do with the relationship between councils, municipalities, and the residents for whom they're responsible for delivering services. And so, if I can just make this last point on your question about price. And I think that I made the point earlier that our housing environment makes it difficult for municipalities to think in terms of revenue collection from new urban settlements, even in the longer term. That needs to change. But in respect of the delivery of sustainable, properly invested, properly capitalized infrastructure, the question about price is not should there be a price, the question is what price. And the economics of this is very straightforward. The textbook economics is hugely important. The capital costs of building a new water supply dam and putting in the piping to carry water from one catchment area across a mountain into another town, those capital costs can be very large. They do not have to be recovered from users. They need to be recovered from the system as a whole. And I think Sean is right. One needs to think about the water system as a whole as recovering its costs. But the marginal user needs to pay a price that is the marginal cost, or the marginal cost plus a small return. And the point is that the marginal cost of delivering water, when you've built solid infrastructure that is built for 100 years and that is sufficient for the expansion of the township over the next 30 years, once you've put that infrastructure in place, the marginal costs of maintenance are comparatively low. They're a lot lower than the costs of trying to maintain inadequate systems that rely on water pipes that burst all the time, flood water that gets into the sanitation system, sanitation that's running down the streets, and toilets that have to be cleaned by municipal officials. We have to be willing to make the infrastructure investments that are necessary to move towards low cost and sustainable services, but we do need to put prices in place. And one reason for that is that the transfer of funds from the national treasury to a municipality to meet the cost of delivery of services in low-income areas is never a substitute from recovering those costs from the households themselves, because that cash flow from the national government comes to the municipality irrespective of whether the service is delivered. And that's the symptom that Thando is finding everywhere across the country, is non-delivery, low levels of accountability and responsibility by municipal officials. But when the payments come from households themselves, subsidized where necessary, but households are given not just voice, but also buying power, and it doesn't need to cover more than the marginal costs, then the relationship between residents and municipalities is quite different. We do need to make that transition.
Great, thanks. Sean, I see you were suitably provoked or stimulated by that. So let me give you a chance. We are heading towards the end of the session, but I think we have another 5 minutes or so. Sure.
No, it's not by what Andrew said. I wanted to say a little bit about procurement, infrastructure procurement. In the 6 months that I've been the DG of DWS, what I've found is that our procurement is very poor, our infrastructure procurement. It's the main reason why we underspend on our budgets, which in turn is criminal in the situation that we're in with the water supply and sanitation challenges in the country. It's so embarrassing and it's really unacceptable that we can underspend on our budgets. And the main reason for that within national DWS is our weak procurement. We have a large construction unit. It incurs large amounts of fruitless and wasteful expenditure because of weak procurement. Sometimes it can't work because it has no fuel to put in the machines, or it has no spare parts. And it's all due to very weak procurement. What I found is that procurement has never been modernized in DWS. It's still done the same way that it's been done for decades. It's viewed as a clerical function. No, it's not viewed as anything which needs to be treated strategically, which needs some very smart thinking into how it's done. So I think it is possible to turn it around. Although the regulatory framework for procurement is very difficult, there's so many different documents on the Treasury website. It's very hard to work out exactly what you can do. It's very opaque. And very confusing. But I think within the current regulatory framework, notwithstanding its weaknesses, I think we can really improve our procurement, infrastructure procurement in DWS, and I intend to work with my colleagues to do that, so that we do it a lot more smartly. And so it's not necessary just because something is a government thing, like a government construction unit, that it has to be so inefficient and it has to be so poorly run that it runs out of spare parts and diesel all the time. It can be done efficiently. But these problems that I experience in national DWS, they're very widespread at municipal level as well. So we give 2 large grants to municipalities, the Regional Bulk Infrastructure Grant and the Water Services Infrastructure Grant. There's also widespread underspending on those grants, and it's also largely due to very weak procurement at municipal level as well.
Thanks. Yes, thanks, Sean. I mean, I certainly agree there's some real weaknesses in the operationalization of public procurement rules. And part of that is just the sheer complexity of it, overly complex. But that doesn't mean that we should accept inefficiency, because there will always be a degree of public procurement for infrastructure that can and should be executed efficiently. I strongly agree with you there. Colleagues on the panel, Pule, closing remarks from your side, and then I'll come to Thando and Andrew for closing remarks as well.
All right, wonderful. Thank you. I'm reminded that I haven't really responded on the SALGA question. So SALGA is a very important partner in infrastructure delivery. I mean, they hold a very important relationship with the municipalities. They also are holding a very important responsibilities in ensuring that that as a stakeholder, it is in key conversations that are talking to specific reforms. They need to be on the table early enough so that as these conversations continue, it is not too late for them to actually be able to talk to. What we are finding, however, is that the consultative process within the SALGA processes sometimes, take a little bit longer than expected, and I think that frustration it is mainly that because of the structure that SALGA has in going through their consultation process. I would add also that most of the conversation actually can be had, and we are actually having conversation with SALGA at different platforms. We do also have the specific structures that actually follow the budget process where SALGA is involved as well. And it is something that we continue to do, and I find that by not having SALGA, it is actually a recipe for failure. You should actually have SALGA in this sphere of government. Thank you.
Great, thanks. Thando, any closing remarks from your side?
Yes. One thing that I can say is that I've worked with informal settlements communities for maybe over 6 years now. And in all those years, one thing remains is that communities just want to be heard. Communities want basic services. They can be frustrated, yes, but once we have engagements with them and we make them understand where the municipality is coming from, what constraints they may have. They might have a capacity issue, and where communities need to come in, how they can monitor, how they can assist municipalities. When we have that nice cycle of engagement or participation between municipalities and communities, we find that communities are really open in having several more engagements with municipalities. They guard the facilities more. They talk as communities that we really need to take care of these facilities because there may be criminality in the community, and that's not everyone in these communities. So it could be like criminals in the community, and they have to work together, and they just honestly want to be heard. And that's why when we as IBPSA and Asivigelane, when we try to engage with municipalities, it's all about opening a platform and between communities and municipalities. When that starts, communities can see that something is happening in my community. I now have a tap. I didn't have one. My refuse is being collected now. Everything is working really smoothly, and they tell other communities. And that's how Asivigelane grew, and that's why we have like over 4,000 community members part of Asivigelane, because they've seen that once we engage with municipalities, something really happens. So my last words is, if you work for a local municipality, please be open to speak to NGOs, be open to speak to us, be open to speak to community members. They don't always want to fight, they basically just want basic services. That's it. Yeah.
Thank you, Thando. In fact, one of the things that I learned in fact, speaking to a civic association in Cape Town was precisely the sort of radical ideas around public housing policy that Andrew was talking to. They're saying the state needs to get out of the way in saying that it's going to be providing houses. It's taking far too long for that to happen. What we need is access to well-titled land with reliable infrastructure installed, and we will take it from there, which I thought was a very radical statement that I had not expected to come, but it shows the benefit of listening, particularly as a public servant, of putting the emphasis into listening, not talking all the time. Andrew, any final comments from your side? There's certainly quite a bit. I had that has been raised. Yeah, over to you.
I've said enough, I'm sure, but just one last point, which is one has to think about the different categories of infrastructure and infrastructure services differently. They all raise their own challenges. We've not talked about transport, an enormously important reform. If we want to see better governance, if we want to see more responsible expenditure, an enormously important change would be for prices, assets and services to be carved up and devolved to the management of the cities or the metros that they serve. And I think that we would see a huge turnaround if that were done. One can make similar points about some of the land that Transnet is sitting on in our cities. But it's been a great panel. We've talked about a lot of things, and it's been really interesting.
I would very much like to have maybe our next winter school being specifically on these questions of mobility in not just urban areas, but right across the country. I mean, I think that they're absolutely critical growth issues for us. So let me, I think, draw this panel discussion to a close. Songezo Ndugane, I do notice that you had a Q&A, but I can't find it, unfortunately, in the Q&A. I'm just not sufficiently techno-literate. I do apologize for that. I'm sure there will be a chance to engage further with each of the panelists. If you do have queries or questions or want to pick up on some of these discussions, I think where we got to in this panel was really confirming that infrastructure does matter, not just to engineers and planners and economists and bureaucrats, but it matters fundamentally to communities, and particularly poor communities, who really do need a good infrastructure base in order to be able to take forward in their lives and create opportunities for themselves. So the human element in infrastructure is really critical. And our approaches to asset management really do need to start to put people first, put people front and center. Because infrastructure ultimately is around the long run growth potential of South Africa and each of the communities across South Africa, big and small. It sets down that potential in space and will define the directions and the nature of growth for generations to come often. But it also critically sets up two key sets of tensions that we need to pay quite a lot of attention to from a public policy perspective. Tensions over the financing of that infrastructure, which I think Andrew dealt with very, very well. And we discussed in terms of the relationship between price or choice and community voice in ensuring value for money in infrastructure, and tensions over the right governance models for infrastructure that do need, as Andrew ended up by saying, to respond to not only the nature of those infrastructure assets, but to the society that's looking to govern those infrastructure assets. And that, again, brings us back to the critical human dimension of that concrete that we and steel that we want to set in the ground to ensure that services are delivered. So big thank you to the panel today. And with that, I'll hand it back over to the studio.
Thank you so much, David. That was quite a nice, very informative session that you facilitated with your panel there. Thank you, Thando. Thank you, Andrew. And as well as thank you, Pule, for informative discussion that you had there, and all our participants that joined through the discussion. It was insightful, and I think clearly proper municipal management is a pressing need, especially when it comes to collaboration with our local stakeholders. Also, goes to underscore the importance of proper management or understanding the role of infrastructure, or the role that infrastructure has in our community. Thank you so much once again, David, and the colleagues that have were in the session. The poll has went up on screen. If you can just complete the poll for us, while as we're gonna take a quick 15 minutes break, we should be here well in time. During the break, you can go to the break session just to see what we have. You can go to the booths, and you can also later on after join the next session. And the next session is a session that certainly I wouldn't want to miss. We know that over the past year or so, about 64 municipalities were found wanting by the Auditor General. One of the most key concerns that the Auditor General addressed was the proper or poor financial mismanagement of those municipalities. So we ask a question after the break: who should raise revenue? What revenues should be raised? And most importantly, how should municipalities manage their revenues much appropriately? And to help us do that will be Matthew Klesa joining us from the States. You don't want to miss that session. See you in a short while after the break in 15 minutes time. Remember, the poll is on the screen now.